Hello, and welcome to the first of the series of the Williamsburg-Yorktown American Revolution Roundtables, lectures, and presentations, brought to you by the American Revolution Consortium for Civic Education and the Real American Revolution Public Television Program. My name is Jeff Lambert, and I'm the president of the Roundtable. And I'm going to turn the program over now to Randy Flood, who is our vice president, and he's going to introduce you to our speaker for this presentation.
Thank you, Jeff. My name is Randy Flood, and in addition to our guest speaker, we're joined today by our roundtable colleague, historian Ted Hammer, who's generously provided us with this technical assistance for this Zoom session. Now, our speaker today is award-winning author Arthur Lefkowitz, who is also a member of the Board of Governors of the American Revolution Roundtable. Now, Art's books include a long list of outstanding books. One is called The Long Retreat, also George Washington's Indispensable Men, The American Turtle Submarine, also Benedict Arnold's Army about the 1775 American invasion of Canada, and also Benedict Arnold in the Company of Heroes. Now today, Art will be talking about his latest book, Eyewitness Images from the American Revolution. Art, it's a pleasure to welcome you, and we look forward to your presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, Art Lefkowitz.
Why, thank you for this kind invitation, and it's my pleasure to be able to talk about my book. You should see the image of the cover now, Eyewitness Images from the American Revolution, which was published in I'm sorry, I'm getting old, 2017. So let's begin the story. The three most recognized images in the Western world are this picture, the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci, this image, The Last Supper, also by Leonardo da Vinci, and this painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware. I believe that most people could identify and name this picture, but they'd be very hard pressed to tell you who the artist was. The artist was an obscure German painter named Emanuel Leutze. Leutze was born in Germany in 1825 to Philadelphia. Young Leutze showed a talent for art, and as was the custom of the time before income tax, let's say, that wealthy people decided to patronize Leutze and pay for his art education. Leutze decided to return to Germany to study art at the Dusseldorf Academy of Art, where he studied for a number of years and where he created this painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware. There were actually two versions of the painting. They were very large. These were historical paintings, a very large canvas meant to depict some great historic scene. The first version that Leutze painted remained in Germany, where it eventually became one of the art treasures of Nazi Germany. It was in the Hamburg Museum when the Second World War started, and the painting remained in the museum where it was when the city was bombed by the Royal Air Force, the British Air Force. The original was destroyed. The destruction of Washington Crossing the Delaware was, in fact, the final shot of the American Revolution. Fortunately, Leutze created a second version, and he purposely created a second version of this painting to bring to the United States, where it would be exhibited as a money-making venture. You're talking about the painting was completed in 1851. You're talking about a time before there were movies or other forms of entertainment that are common today. And it was very popular at the time to go and view these very large historic paintings, which were considered the highest form of art at the time. Leutze had no interest in creating a historically accurate image of Washington crossing the Delaware. It's an imaginary image. And let's look at it artistically. It's very interesting because Leutze was a trained artist. He created a triangular composition. You can see it here, so that your eye is always drawn to Washington's image. The second thing that he created artistically that's interesting is that here you have Washington in this dramatic event of the American Revolution, at one of the darkest moments of the American Revolution, with the American army crossing from Pennsylvania to New Jersey. And so you're going from the darkness to the brightness of the future and the great victory of the American Revolution. Now, again, Leutze made no attempt to be historically accurate. The most glaring historical inaccuracy of the painting is the flag. This is the so-called the Betsy Ross flag, the 13 stars and stripes. This was adopted by Congress in July of 1777, some 6 months after Washington crossed the Delaware. So the flag did not exist. Also, this flag was adopted by the Continental Congress primarily to identify American ships at sea. There is no evidence that this flag was ever carried by an American army in the American Revolution. The Americans were using patriotic or regimental or state flags. The so-called national colors only appear very late in the war. It may have been flown, for example, from Washington's headquarters late in the war. Also, there are a few interesting isolated images of the picture of the flag being used. For example, here, this buckle from a shoulder belt, a leather shoulder belt, was uncovered in an archaeological dig in Pluckbin, New Jersey, about 10 years ago. Pluckbin was the site of Henry Knox's School of Artillery. And here you have the image of the flag. There's another image of the flag that appears where the flag is flying over Fort Stanwix, New York. So the flag may have flown over fortifications, for example, but clearly the flag did not exist when Washington crossing the Delaware. The sword, for example, is an 1840s Prussian period sword. Leutze has Washington crossing the Delaware in a kind of rowboat. We know that the Continental Army crossed the Delaware in what were called Durham boats, very large boats used on the Delaware River to carry ore and grain down the river to Philadelphia. We know that the river on the night, this is the Delaware River, except in the painting, this is not the Delaware River, this is the Rhine River. You're looking at the Rhine River in Germany. And you know that the night Washington crossed the Delaware, there was sheets of ice, flowing ice, but here you have these very dramatic kind of giant chunks of ice on the river. If you recognize any of your ancestors in the painting on the boat with Washington, what Leutze did was he wanted Americans in the painting. And so anytime an American tourist stumbled onto Dusseldorf, Germany, at the time that he was painting this, he had them sit and pose as figures in the boat. This figure is, at the time, Lieutenant James Monroe, the 5th President of the United States. Monroe did partake in the Battle of Trenton, but he was definitely, there's no evidence that he was on the boat with, the same boat with Washington. The Washington head is actually the Houdon bust of Washington. The most interesting aspect of this painting, Leutze selected this particular image, this scene from the American Revolution, because at the time that he was studying and painting in Germany, there was the beginning of a democratic movement in Germany. Germany at the time was composed of numerous small principalities who, the nobility who controlled these little fiefdoms or kingdoms with an army. And so Leutz is making a very powerful political message in this painting. He purposely picked this particular moment of the American Revolution to tell the German people that here this amateur army defeated a professional German army, a Hessian army at Trenton, New Jersey. And so if the Americans could do this in 1776, then why couldn't the German people overthrow these German armies in the 1850s? The German nobility got the message very quickly, and Leutz, as they say, left town, leaving behind this, our image, our feeling of what the American Revolution looked like. It's interesting, before we go on to look at some realistic images, we should look at a couple of popular additional images from the war. Hold on a second, here we go. So we're gonna continue. And here's a very popular image of the American Revolution painted by an American artist named John Vanderlyn. John Vanderlyn was the first American to study art in France. And he was patronized, interestingly, by Aaron Burr, who promoted and helped support his artistic training, and wanted Vanderlyn to study in France and not in England at the time. And here you have, this was painted in 1806, and here you have this revival image of, you see, like Greek statues, the silhouettes of the image. A very dramatic image. This is, of course, the death of Jane McCrae, an incident involved with the Burgoyne campaign. Exactly what happened to Jane McCrae, if she was actually accidentally killed, it remains questionable. But Vanderlyn painted this image. By the way, here's Jane McCrae's fiance, a loyalist officer in the background. Can you see that, running to try and save her? And and she's dressed in a, you know, French costume of the period. It's not correct for the period of the American Revolution. But this image was very popular in 19th century America as a justification for the Americans to annihilate the Indians, to show them as barbarians, as savages, these cruel people who not only were killing innocent women and children, but also an excuse for them to confiscate their land. And so here's another great popular depiction, totally inaccurate, of the American Revolution. Now, this also has a very interesting history. This is the capture of Major John Andre, the British spy, by 3 American militiamen, the leader of whom is this man, John Pauling. And the artist, I have to tell you the artist's name in just a moment. And anyway, here's the Hudson River in the background. This was painted in 1834. And Pauling is depicted bigger than life on purpose to dramatize the idea behind the painting. New York City at the time was very corrupt. There was a lot of dishonest politicians. And here the artist is showing you that this spy is offering these 3 Americans this huge bribe. What's happened is they were suspicious of him. They stopped him at Tarrytown, New York, and they forced him to undress, and they found, when they took off his shoes, they found a map the defenses of West Point and a list of where the troops were. They didn't realize at the time that it was in the handwriting of Benedict Arnold. And so being exposed as Pauling quotes the famous words, "My God, after looking at the papers, my God, he is a spy." And here Andre is offering the three militiamen a huge bribe if he allows them to continue to British-held New York. So the image is talking about corruption, and here this great event in American Revolution where these three honest Americans refused a huge bribe. And in a moment, I will tell you the artist's name. And okay, let's go on. Okay, now here, this was painted in the late 1890s by the great American illustrator Howard Pyle. This is Pyle's depiction of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Pyle was one of the great illustrators of American books in the 1890s and the father of the so-called Brandywine School of Art. Now, the picture is totally historically inaccurate. Pyle did his very best to research this event of the Battle of Bunker Hill, but he had so little information to go on, and it was very difficult for him to research the event from museums and libraries in England. He had to work with books at the time, histories of the American Revolution, which inaccurately depicted the British marching up Bunker Hill in a column like this, in a tight formation with their knapsacks. And actually the frontal attack was a diversion. The real British attack was going to come from the flanks, but they marched up Bunker Hill in the center. But we know that they marched up, or they ran up, in a very loose formation. They dropped all their packs. They rushed up the hill. Of course, they came up, I recall, was it 3 or 4 times until they finally were able to overwhelm the Americans. But here you have an artist who tried very hard to accurately depict an event. He just didn't have the information that we have today. The knapsacks are particularly interesting. These are Napoleonic period knapsacks. Here you can see an image, a portrait, which shows the knapsack that the British Army was using at the time of the American Revolution. It was a goatskin knapsack. So we've looked at some inaccurate but very popular historical images of the American Revolution, but now let's look at the real stuff, where we really could learn and learn from these pictures. And we start with this man. His name was Amos Doolittle. He was a New Haven jeweler, saddle makers. These guys were multitaskers. He was a printer. He was a member of the 2nd Connecticut Foot Guards, which was commanded by then Captain Benedict Arnold, and they marched up to Lexington and Concord a week after the revolution began to reinforce what was then called the New England Army of Observation. And Doolittle, being entrepreneurial, realized that there was a market for him to go out and depict the opening events of the American Revolution. Fortunately, another member of the Connecticut Foot Guards was an artist named Ralph Earl. And Doolittle and Earl got permission from their captain, Benedict Arnold, to go out and to sketch the opening moments of the American Revolution. So here, Doolittle created 4 prints. They're all in black and white. If you find any that are colored, they were colored by hand after they were printed. A complete set of the Doolittle prints today, uncolored, if it should come up for sale, is worth at least $100,000. So here you have the first moment of the American Revolution, where the British Army is marched out of Boston and they come to the village of Lexington. The Lexington militia had been alerted, the countryside had been alerted that the British were on the march to the village of Concord, further down the road, where the Massachusetts militia had been gathering military stores, and the militia stood here. Now, what is unique here? This is the great turning point in world history. This is why I find the American Revolution so fascinating, because for the first time in history, men really took control over how they were going to be governed. What was going on here was the British were using the army as a police force. For primarily riot control. So if there was some kind of rioting or insurrection, let's say somewhere in England, and this was going on constantly, that they would call out the army to put down the rebellion. Now, before the army could take action, which meant firing on a crowd or charging into them on horseback with sabers drawn, they were required, some local official was required to read what was called the Riot Act. And the Riot Act was passed in 1714. And it's important to understand that the difference here is that the Americans had developed this system of self-defense, which they called the militia system, where they were armed and had military organization, and they had leaders with some military experience. And so now the British Army wasn't facing a mob with pitchforks and clubs. They were facing an organized military resistance. And it's interesting. It's interesting. I want to read to you the Riot Act. The Riot Act required that someone, again, stand in front of a mob, whether they could hear him or not was totally irrelevant, and read the Riot Act. And the Riot Act said, "Our sovereign Lord the King charges and commandeth all persons being assembled immediately to disperse themselves and peacefully to depart to their habitations or to their lawful business upon the pains contained in the act made in the first year of King George for preventing tumults and riotous assemblies. God save the king." They were given about a minute to disperse, and if they didn't disperse, then the army would fire on them to disperse them. Here, again, the army is shown, the troops coming out of Boston, under Colonel Smith, second in command, John Pitcairn, fire on the Lexington militia who disperse. So they move on to the village of Concord, and this is very interesting. Here's the old Beekman Tavern, which doesn't exist anymore, but this is the main street of Concord. And if you go to Concord today, this is the main street of the village. And this graveyard is still there from the main road, so you can stand on the road, you can climb up this hill. Here's Colonel Smith and Major Pitcairn looking out. Now the countryside has been alerted and the militia is gathering on the other side of the old North Bridge. There's fighting that takes place, which would be the third image. But I want to go on and look at the most important historically image of the four Doolittle prints. Now, Ralph Earl, the artist, was capable of creating images which were much more realistic, much more professional than these. But Doolittle was anxious to get these images printed so he could sell them. So here you have the road back to Boston from Concord. And here's the troops under Pitcairn and Smith making their way back. Early on, they realized that the countryside had been alerted that the militia was out in force. And so reinforcements come out from Boston under Lord Percy. They've got artillery with them. So what's going on here is, here's the Americans behind fences, you see, the Massachusetts militia shooting at the British, who are lined up in their red coats on the road. Well, how stupid could these British soldiers be? It looks ridiculous, but it's not. There's a logical explanation for this, and you can see it here. By this point, based primarily on the Scottish Rebellion of 1745, the British had developed a strategy for keeping irregular troops from firing on them. They called it flanking companies. So a group of soldiers would run out from the main formation and attack and fire on, in this case, the Massachusetts militia. What they wanted to do was keep them out of musket range from the army, which they're doing by using this flanking company technique. You can see it right here. And so although the militia could see the British soldiers, their muskets, which had an effective range of 80 to 100 yards, couldn't hit them. And that was the whole, this is what saved the British Army and got them back to Boston by using this technique, the strategy of the flanking companies. The British were also burning every building within musket range of the army to prevent the Americans from hiding in the buildings and shooting at the British. Everything was burned. And so here you have the Doolittle prints. So let's see what's next here. Aha. Here's a very interesting, a very obscure painting by a British artist named Francis Whitley. This is showing, this is called the encampment at Brighton. What's going on here is every summer, the British Army would set up an encampment in the seaside town of Brighton, and they would invite young men to come and tour the encampment, speak to the soldiers, and this was one of their basic methods for recruiting men to join the British Army. The British Army, except for a very short period in the American Revolution, was an all-volunteer army. It was a very small army. It was a good army by standards of the time. It was not the best army in the world, but it was a good army. So if you think about the brutal discipline and the lifestyle of a soldier in the British Army at the time of the American Revolution, why would they possibly join? There were many advantages for a young man to join the British Army. First, civilian labor was very difficult. You know, the hours were long, the pay was very bad. You could be beaten if you got hurt on the job. There was no compensation for you. Very long, very hard life as a young man with no education. Medical help was completely unknown, and these people had no money. When they joined the army, it was very interesting. They had many advantages. First, they got a regular pay. Secondly, they could not be punished without a court-martial. Thirdly, the food was above average for the period. They were encouraged to be educated. They were educated if they showed any talent within the army, because the army needed sergeants who could keep records, who could write well, who could provide all the administrative detail that the army required. So young men were actually encouraged to go into the camp at Brighton during the summer and to talk to the soldiers and to enlist in the army. And they did enlist. It was, for the period, not a bad way of life. Also, unknown, completely unknown at the time, they were eligible for a pension. They had, it was crude, but they had some medical attention. There were doctors who were attached to the army to attend to their medical needs. Now, in the foreground, what you have are 3 British dragoons. Although this was painted in 1796, it still shows the type of uniform worn by the British dragoons at the time of the Revolution. Dragoons were mounted soldiers on smaller horses. They were lightly armed. They were used primarily for reconnaissance work, for scouting, for special missions, like dragoons captured General Charles Lee at Basking Ridge, New Jersey in late 1776. The British had 2 dragoon regiments in America during the Revolution. It was very expensive to outfit and to maintain mounted troops. The Americans had 4 small dragoon regiments. The British had 2 larger regiments. But here's a typical British dragoon of the period of the American Revolution. Here's an interesting detail. Correctly in the painting, the artist is showing that the bayonet that they carried was carried on the saddle. The helmet is correct for the period of the American Revolution. I'm going to show you another image. Now here it says a Philadelphia Light Horse Dragoon Trooper 1775. You see, this is post-revolutionary. This is what people think dragoons were wearing at the time of the revolution. The helmet is incorrect. The high collar, well, as soon as you see this high collar, it's post-Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War collar was flat. We'll see more images of that. And of course, a very fine detail, but the bayonet and scabbard are missing from the saddle, which are correct for the British dragoons of the time of the Revolution. Now, okay, we know that as soon as the British began to assemble to their raid on Concord, the images that I showed you from the Doolittle prints, but yet the Massachusetts militia and the Patriots seemed to have a lot of advance notice of the movements of the British Army around Boston. And we believe that this woman was a spy for the Americans. She was the wife of the British commander-in-chief of the time, Thomas Gage. Her name was Margaret Kimball Gage. And here is her portrait painted by the greatest of the colonial American artists, John Singleton Copley. Copley painted her in New York in 1772. She was the belle of New York society. She was married to the commander-in-chief of the British Army in America. The Kimball family were very influential, very wealthy family. And Copley had no formal training. There was no art training available in America except from itinerant artists. Anyone who wanted art training went to Britain at the time. But Copley was a fantastic artist. He painted her in this very risque costume at the time. It almost looks like bed clothing. And Turkish clothing, it was a strong Turkish influence in America at the time in terms of fashion. So here she's got this, it's actually a scarf wrapped around her head in the Turkish fashion, and this detail of the belt, which is Turkish. It's a magnificent portrait. It's in the Timken Museum of Art in San Diego. And so we don't know for certain her contact. If she was the American spy, she had access to her husband's headquarters. She could go in there freely. She was may have been looking at all his papers, passing information on to the Americans. The person who knew the most about her was Dr. Joseph Warren, who was killed at Bunker Hill. But Warren alluded to the fact that it was a woman who was giving the Sons of Liberty, the Patriots, information about the movements of the British Army in Boston. So here's a Copley painting. Now, unfortunately, Copley, who painted Samuel Adams, painted Paul Revere, he was a loyalist, and he left America at the start of the American Revolution and never returned. So his portraits are all pre-Revolutionary War. Here's one of his greatest portraits in the Philadelphia Museum of Art of Thomas Mifflin. This was Washington's first aide-de-camp. He was a Philadelphia businessman, and here he is painted with his wife. Mifflin and his wife went to Boston in 1771, where they wanted to be painted by Copley. The composition is very interesting because they're separated. You see there's 2 figures, but Copley very cleverly brings the image, brings the 2 of them together by Mifflin's extended hand and the table that they're both joining them together. There's also a very strong political message here, because here Mifflin's wife is making fringe in a little loom in defiance of the British the boycotting of importing British goods from America, one of which would have been lace and fringe. So here she's making fringe to show their support for the patriot cause. A magnificent Copley portrait. Unfortunately, again, he left America at the start of the Revolution and never returned. So here's one of the many maps created for the British Army and the Royal Navy during the Revolution. Of course, after Boston in 1776, the Revolution turns to New York. Here's the city of New York on the lower tip of Manhattan Island. New York, the Patriots knew early on that the British objective was to seize the city of New York. It had been their military headquarters during the colonial wars against the French, and using New York was very logical. First, it has one of the world's best natural harbors right here. This harbor never freezes, although it did freeze twice in the 18th century. It was, 90 or perhaps 70 miles across New Jersey to Philadelphia. More significantly, the Hudson River was navigable for ocean-going ships at the time for 150 miles. So the British wanted the city of New York to use as their headquarters to defeat the rebellion. And the American Army moves from Massachusetts to defend New York. So here's the first portrait. Normally you might say the earliest known, but we know so much about Washington and about his portraits that this is the first portrait of Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the American Army. It was painted by the American artist Charles Wilson Peale. Peale had some art training. He went to London in the late 1760s, and he studied under the American artist Benjamin West. He also was influenced by other British artists at the time. There's some very interesting things going on here. This was painted in late May and June of 1776, just a month or two before the arrival of the first British ships into New York Harbor. The Americans had by this point become aware that the British were going to attack New York City to capture it, but Congress wanted to meet with Washington, and he rushed down to Philadelphia to meet with them for a few days. John Hancock, unknown to Washington, told Peale that he wanted Peale to paint Washington's portrait for Hancock to own. Washington reluctantly agreed. It was a political move on the part of Washington. He was a very astute politician, and he didn't want to alienate Hancock. So he reluctantly agreed to sit for this portrait by Peale, even though he was very anxious to return to New York. Now, there's some things that are going on here that are important to understand. First, Peale had great difficulty painting hands, so he did everything he could to hide Washington's hands, you see. The second thing that you see here that's interesting is this device. This is not a sash. This is not a ribbon. This is called a riband of office. Early in the American Revolution, the Continental Army instituted a series of colored ribands to identify rank and function within the American Army. Aides de camp wore a green ribbon. Washington, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army, was the only person authorized to wear a light blue ribbon. So whoever this person was, I mean, Washington was well known, but whoever wore this light blue riband of office was the commander-in-chief of the American Army. There were no stars on the epaulets at all. The epaulette is very small, American-made. I'm going to show you some portraits later, which show the influence of the French and how the epaulette becomes larger and more elaborate as the war goes on. Look at the position of the buttons and the cuff. You see it's a V-shaped button, V-shaped cuff with 3 buttons. You can identify Washington's uniforms and the dating of the portrait by studying the details, particularly of the cuff and the position, how the buttons are organized. Also, the uniform is very tight-fitting. This is the clothing of the period. So it looks like Washington is like busting out of the vest. This is not, this is historically accurate. Look how tight-fitting the color is. So you got the epaulets. Now Washington adapted the color of blue and buff, and this was emulated by all of his officers out of respect for Washington. The colors of uniforms by the American Army would come much later in the war. The sword at Washington's side he wore throughout his life, and in all of his portraits the same sword appears. This is Boston in the background, a little hard to tell. This portrait was painted twice by Peale. One is in the Brooklyn Museum of Art. The second one is in the collection of the White House. So here's the Washington portrait, and let's see what we got here. And oh, look at this. You see, here's the Oval Office. Here's the Oval Office with President Ronald Reagan. It's very interesting that the president gets to select the artwork from the collection of the White House that goes into the Oval Office. And Reagan purposely picked the Washington 1776 portrait. It's established that he understood the political meaning behind this portrait, that Washington was anxious to get back to New York. But politically, he realized how important it was to maintain a good relationship with John Hancock. And so he agreed to stay in Philadelphia to have the portrait painted. Peale painted Washington from life the most of any artist during the Revolution, because Washington respected Peale. Peale was a Philadelphia militia officer, and Peale was a stickler for uniform details. And so if you study the Peale portraits artistically, they're nothing compared to the work of an artist like Copley, but in terms of accuracy of uniform, they are correct. So here, you know, the Oval Office, and Ronald Reagan picked personally that he wanted this portrait because he understood he was obviously a great admirer of Washington, but the White House had a number of Washington portraits. He wanted this one for the Oval Office. Here, British engineers and artillery officers were trained as artists. They had formal training at Woolwich, the Academy for Artillerists and Engineers. They were trained as watercolorists and to draw, to rapidly depict terrain so that they could explain or show illustration to British senior commanders. They also began to paint and draw for their own interest and for selling the paintings to wealthy British officers. Now, one of the British engineers who was trained is this man, Archibald Robinson. And here, interestingly, a British fleet has arrived in New York Harbor. This is the entrance to the inner harbor of New York. This would be Staten Island. Here, the spit of land would be Coney Island. And by the way, the word coney is Dutch for rabbit. I think it's strange that in some places in America, they sell something called a coney, meaning a hot dog. Well, it actually means a rabbit. Well, that's another story. And this is the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. And this is Brooklyn, which would be the western tip of Long Island. And here, the British fleet that's that's gathering to attack the American-held city of New York. The British occupied Staten Island right away. This would be July 2nd, 1776, but the Americans held Long Island and New York City. They gathered here at modern Stapleton, Staten Island, because there was a fresh water source here. The British fleet needed fresh water. This was called the watering place at the time. Much of the well water around New York had already been fouled and was not drinkable even by the time of the Revolution, but there was a fresh water springs here, so the British fleet gathered here. This is the arrival of the HMS Eagle, the flagship of Admiral Lord Howe, who arrived, and so Archibald Robinson is depicting the arrival of the fleet. This drawing and all the Archibald Robinson drawings are owned presently by the New York Public Library. Now, this is Thomas Dowdsworthy. This all pertains to the Battle of Long Island and the British attack to seize the city of New York. What you have here is a captain in the Brigade of Guards, an elite British regiment, if you would, that participated in the Battle of Long Island. The artist's name is Blackburn. But what's so interesting here, what's going on here, is early on, the British realized that the Americans were intentionally trying to kill the officers first. This was unknown in warfare at the time. This was considered barbaric. Now, to this very day, it's being argued whether the Americans were intentionally shooting at the officers first. But whatever the case was, the British decided early on that they wanted the officers to look like the common soldier, so they couldn't be distinguished. Even though, so what you have here is an officer with no indication of rank. Now here his portrait was painted when he returned to England, so there are two devices which would have indicated him as an officer: a gorget, the last piece of body armor, and this sash, which would have also been an indicator. It's being debated whether the sash had some official function within the British Army, or it was just a detail of fashion worn by British officers. But you see, there's nothing here to indicate that this man is an officer. If you'd remove these two devices, he's carrying a musket. Officers did not normally carry muskets, if you would, a musket armed with a bayonet. So he's dressed like a common soldier. And this is a very interesting portrait in that respect, and brings up the whole issue that the British weren't stupid. They realized they were changing and modifying their strategies and techniques for the war in America. And this is one of the ideas that they implemented, making sure that it became difficult to identify who the officers were. Uniquely, the coats that the British officers wore, although they looked like common soldiers, were of a much brighter, finer color and material. So even though they were trying to disguise themselves as private soldiers, the Americans could pick out the officers because of the finer quality of their clothing. Here you have another interesting eyewitness image of the New York campaign. After capturing the city of New York, the British wanted to move up the Hudson River, come behind the American lines, and here you have the narrowest point in the Hudson River. This happens to be the exact site of the present George Washington Bridge, which was built there because this is the narrowest point. This is New Jersey, Fort Lee, which was an American fortification at the time. This is you can still follow this road down to the ferry. And here's Manhattan here. This would be Fort Washington. The Americans heavily fortified the lower Hudson. They also put obstructions in the water in the river called chevaux de frise. These were giant logs with pointed tips with iron tips on them to try to tear the bottoms out of any British ship that attempted to run the Hudson River. It was a very expensive defense line which totally failed. The British were able to run through the Fort Lee, Fort Washington defense line. Although the British Army was a good army, the Royal Navy was the best Navy at the time. These were very experienced sailors, and they waited for the right tide and the right wind, and they went rushing past the defenses of Fort Lee and Fort Washington. General Washington questioned the validity of holding this defense line. And of course, eventually the British would overrun on November 16th, 1776. They'd overrun Fort Washington in 4 hours. And then on the 19th of November, they captured Fort Lee. And here's 3 British frigates. This is an eyewitness account by the British naval artist Dominic Serres, the great naval artist of the period, the Royal Naval artist to King George III. His specialty was drawing clouds and gunfire, you see, smoke from the guns. And here's 3 British frigates and 2 tenders carrying weapons to arm the loyalists up the Hudson River. This was painted 4 times. There are 4, you can't say copies, there are 4 versions. They're all a little different. This is the one at the museum at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. Whoops, we go, here's another rendering by, in this case, a British artillery officer named Thomas Davies, who was trained at Woolwich to draw and to paint in watercolor. They painted in watercolor because watercolor was very portable and could be carried. Here you see the Hudson River here. Here's the British warship, the Pearl, on the Hudson River. This is the attack on Fort Washington. This would be the Harlem River, an extension of the East River. And here the British are coming around to the side of Fort Washington. And Fort Washington is obscured here, but it would be around here. And this is November 16th, and this is the attack on Fort Washington. And Thomas Davies was a very obscure British officer, and he sold these paintings to high-ranking British officers who could, pay him for them. This was owned by a man named Lord Percy, and the painting has been attributed to Percy for many years, but today we realize who the artist actually was. And here's Thomas Davies' famous watercolor of the British coming up the Hudson Palisades. After they took Fort Washington, they crossed the Hudson and climbed up the Palisades, these cliffs north of Fort Lee, and captured Fort Lee. And let's go on. Whoops. Okay, we're going back here to look. I want to remind you again of Washington crossing the Delaware, to remind you of the flag, and that the flag is inaccurate, the American flag. And we got to look at this. So following the capture of Fort Washington and Fort Lee, the Americans are chased across New Jersey. And that's the subject of my book, The Long Retreat. Washington counterattacks at Trenton, followed by his dramatic victory at the Battle of Trenton. And the subject of flags in the American Revolution cannot go without mentioning the flag in this painting. This is a painting by James Peale, who was Charles Wilson Peale's brother. James Peale was also a militia officer. He was an eyewitness to the Battle of Trenton, a Battle of Princeton, which is January 3rd, 1777. And this painting is actually a conglomeration of a number of events that were not going on at the same time, but he put them all together. This flag next to Washington is referred to as the Washington headquarters flag. This flag has a very interesting history. The flag reputedly was owned by the Valley Forge Historical Society, who claimed that this was Washington's headquarters flag. The flag made its way to the new Museum of the American Revolution, who have, I noticed, quietly kind of put it in storage because it's very confusing whether this flag actually was used by Washington to identify, flown over his headquarters and to identify his position on a battlefield. Now, Washington was a veteran of Indian fighting. Indian tactics, primary to Indian tactics, was to identify the leaders first and kill them, okay, to create disruption and disorganization. It's a completely silly notion for anyone to believe that with Washington's experience, he would have rode onto a battlefield with a flag that would have identified who he was and his position. This seems to actually be, Peel never said what the flag was. It's either part of a larger flag or it's some flag associated with one of the artillery companies or regiments fighting in the Battle of Princeton, to use this painting and to point to that flag and say, well, look at that. That flag is behind Washington. This is his headquarters flag. And this is the flag originally donated to the Valley Forge Historical Society. It's just not a logical idea. So I just want to present that to you. Okay, now here is the famous portrait of Washington's great victory at Princeton. This is modern, this is Nassau Hall, the seat of modern Princeton University. Here's British, could have been Hessian, well, they would have been British prisoners being marched out. Here's Washington. The pose is typical for Peel. This is the pose, a Gainsborough pose. If you look at Gainsborough portraits, when Peel was studying in England, he saw the Gainsborough portraits and he copied them when he created this portrait of Washington. Again, making every effort to hide hands. Here you see the riband of office. Here you see, look, the cuff has changed. Remember the cuff I showed you in the 1776 portrait with a line of buttons? Here you have a different scallop type arrangement and the buttons are in a circular position. The epaulet has become a little larger in this portrait. This portrait was authorized, was paid for by the Pennsylvania legislature in 1779. The portrait was so popular that Peel painted it 18 times. He sold every one of them. Washington portraits were extremely popular. Now, here's the last in the series. This one's owned by Yale, by the Art Museum, Yale University Art Museum. Here's the original, okay, owned today by the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, okay. You see the riband of office is gone, but if you look very closely, you could see that it was there, but after 225 years, the blue color has come through the color of the vest. Here you can very clearly see the color of the commander-in-chief of the army. Okay, so what happened here is, again, Peel was a stickler for the detail of uniform, although the picture is the same. And by the way, in each of the 18 different versions, there are some differences. You can see the differences here in the background. Each one is different. But here, by the time this was painted in 1782, the Americans had eliminated the use of these colored ribands of office and began to adapt, at least for the general officers, a system of stars on epaulets. Brigadier General 1 star, Major General 2 stars. The British Army had the rank of Lieutenant General in the American Revolution. The Americans did not. Washington was the first American to wear 3 stars on his epaulet. The next American officer to wear 3 stars was Ulysses S. Grant, who was a lieutenant general in the American Army. Washington is erroneously sometimes identified as a lieutenant general because he's wearing 3 stars on his epaulet. He wore 3 stars to identify him as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, not the rank of lieutenant general. It did not exist in the American Army. Now here's another of the versions, even a later version of Peale's portrait of Washington at Trenton. This is very late. This is 1783. Look, you see, this is a very late uniform. The scallop or indentation in the cuff is gone. It's now a round barrel cuff. This indicates a very late uniform that Washington was wearing in the Revolution. Peale painted him from life. The uniforms are correct, okay? And here you can see a completely different background. And here, interestingly enough, here's General Hugh Mercer, of course, who was mortally wounded at Princeton. And behind him is the American doctor, Benjamin Rush, who did treat and try to save Mercer's life. And Peale was very good friends with Rush and decided to put him into the painting. So let's go on. Here's this idea that the artist was putting his friends or himself into the Washington portraits is very interesting. Here's one owned by the National Park Service in Philadelphia. Here it was painted by Charles Willson Peale. Peale stuck himself in the back. And here his brother James, okay? And here you could clearly see that late period uniform, you see? The position of the cuffs, very tight fitting. And also you can see the elaborate epaulet that Washington is wearing. And very clearly here are the 3 stars identifying Washington as commander-in-chief of the American Army. It's always the same sword. Every Washington portrait, it's the sword he carried as a young officer in the French and Indian War. Here's another, this is a very interesting portrait by Charles Willson Peale. This is Yorktown in the background, and here's Washington with some of his officers and aides de camp at Yorktown. The composition is very strange. What happened was Charles Willson Peale sent his brother James down to Yorktown because Charles Willson Peale wanted this background for his latest Washington portraits. People who were commissioning the portraits, they no longer wanted to see Princeton in the background. They wanted something that was more up to date. And so Peale wanted to get the image of what Yorktown looked like after the successful American siege of Yorktown. So the painting was actually created to get the background. But Charles Willson Peale took the background and added the figures. Here's Washington. Now, what's interesting, here's a French officer, Rochambeau. What's interesting is that this is an aide de camp. We know that this is Tench Tillman here, that the aides de camp and other functionaries within the Continental Army late in the war adapted the system used by the French to identify function, not rank in the army, which were colored plumes or cockades in their caps. And so an aide de camp was identified by a green plume in their cap. And so there you have Washington at Yorktown. If you look at some later Washington portraits painted by Peale, you look at the background and you'll see this image in the background. Are we going forward here? Let's see. Oh, yes, I'm showing you this to show the composition. Peale always used the same composition. He was not that great an artist, and so he had this basic composition, which he just kept repeating. But here's a fascinating portrait of Stewart, Colonel Walter Stewart, supposedly the handsomest, the Irish beauty, the handsomest officer in the American Army, a Pennsylvania officer. And here, very interestingly, Peale has painted a complete American regimental encampment. Here's Stewart's marquee tent, the tent of his officers, and here are the tents of the enlisted men. It's very hard to see here, but there are, here you can see it here. You have to look at an enlarged version of this painting, which I show in my book. It shows muskets racked, and the bayonets are fixed to the muskets because the bayonets were not universal. A bayonet was fitted to a specific musket. It was not interchangeable. And so when the muskets were racked on these horses, they had to be racked with the bayonets in place. The other fascinating aspect of this particular painting is this is the only image we have of a field kitchen. This is how how 18th century armies were cooking during the Revolution. There was no central cooking. There were messes of perhaps 6 or 8 men, and they'd go into the field. This is an enlargement of the Stewart portrait. They would dig a circular hole. Okay, they'd throw the dirt up into a mound. Here's the guy standing in the hole, and they cut little holes in the mound of dirt, and they would put a little fire in there. Then they had their little pots, and they would cook their meals. It was a one-dish meal. If they threw everything they had into the pot with boiling water. If they had fish, they called it chowder. If they had some meat, they would call it a stew. And here at Fort Ticonderoga, I was very happy to see that they created this. This is how food was cooked at the time of the Revolution. Here's the pit. They would dig this. Every time the army encamped, if they encamped for one night, they could quickly build these little field kitchens. There's the cutout. Here's the dirt piled up. There's the holes, and there they are cooking. So the Peale portrait of Stewart is very valuable for the information that it gives us. Now, here's one of my most favorite paintings from the period of the American Revolution. This is Richard Varick, an aide-de-camp to Washington, an aide-de-camp to Benedict Arnold, trained as a lawyer. The Varick transcripts, he transcripted and copied much of Washington's headquarters papers, which are now in the Library of Congress. This was painted by the American artist Ralph Earl. It's post-Revolutionary War. You can tell immediately by the high collar. You see, if you took away that high collar and you had a flat collar, this could be a Revolutionary War uniform. What's so interesting about, first, Ralph Earl was an alcoholic. He was a spendthrift. He wound up in debtor's prison in New York. And a number of leading New York citizens, including Varick. Varick was a mayor of the city of New York. There's a Varick Street in Manhattan. There's a Varick Street in Jersey City. Varick made a fortune establishing New York City's first suburban community, which was Jersey City, New Jersey. That made him into a wealthy man. But Varick was one of the people who went to debtor's prison in New York and had Earl paint his portrait, and they would pay Earl to help him pay his way out of debtor's prison. What's so interesting about the Varick portrait is that it shows here the badge or the Order of the Cincinnati. Now, if you know nothing else about the portrait you're looking at, as soon as you see the eagle, there's always the eagle. the eagle of the Order of the Cincinnati. Late in the Revolution in 1783, the Americans under Henry Knox organized a fraternal society called the Society of the Cincinnati, and American officers were invited and French officers to join the order. It remains today. And they all proudly wore their eagle to indicate their membership. There are no two eagles that are alike. They were all individually made. And so it's very interesting if you see a portrait with the eagle, got to be post-Revolutionary War. And you see any number of veterans of the American Revolution having their portrait painted, and the eagle is always there on their clothing. Now, this is Howard, governor of Maryland. Howard, I'm trying to remember his first name, but we'll go on.
John Eager Howard.
Thank you, John Eager Howard. Yeah, Eager, of course, was his mother's maiden name, which accounts for some of these strange names you find in the Revolution, like Button Gwinnett. Button was his mother's maiden name, or Tench Tillman is another one. Anyway, you see here in this portrait by Peel of, thank you for telling me, reminding me of his name. Now, this is not the badge of the Cincinnati. The Americans were, or the Continental Congress was frightened that the army at any point might mutiny and overrun the weak civilian government and take over. So what they were doing throughout the war is that they were giving out swords and horses and saddles and medals, doing everything they could think of to keep the army happy, to keep the officers happy, except while they were making all of these grand proclamations and giving out all these paper, citations, they didn't have any money to buy anything. So here, interestingly, this portrait of Howard is painted during after the war. It's a Revolutionary War uniform, but they really didn't have the medal. It was only issued many years later. So Peel just faked the medal. This was a medal for Howard's participation in the Battle of Cowpens. And finally, here, we have so much information now about uniforms and details that was completely unavailable, as try as they hard to men like Howard Pyle, who tried very hard to accurately depict the Revolution. So this is a modern painting by an American artist whose name is Pamela Patrick White. I happen to like her artwork very much. These are Hessian Jaegers, foresters, hired by the British Army as auxiliaries fighting in the area around Brandywine, Pennsylvania. And here, because we have so much information today, she's able to accurately depict what these Jaegers look like. And also, a study of the artwork of the period helps us to gain a lot of information, particularly about what uniforms look like. Here I can tell you, I won't make a mistake, it's Colonel John May, painted by an obscure Danish artist who came to America at the end of the Revolution named Gulager. Here you see a very elaborate epaulet. This is typical of the final years of the American Revolution, when the Americans were importing fabric and importing epaulets from France. Here you see a sash being worn probably as a detail of fashion. But what's so unique and interesting about this particular portrait is not only the size of the hat, but the way the hat was being worn. We know when they talked about the elegantly tipped hat of the American Revolution, this is how the officers and enlisted men were wearing their hats. And so I would humbly say, when I commissioned this painting by the American artist Doll Taylor for the cover of my book, Benedict Arnold and the Company of Heroes, I was able to show him the size of the hat and how it was being worn. And this is Benedict Arnold here. And what's interesting is here is the rifleman could not carry a bayonet. The rifle was too fragile to hold a bayonet. And also it impeded the loading of the rifle. So we believe that American riflemen at some points in the Revolution were armed with a folding spear. So I put that in. I show from the Stuart portrait the rack of muskets being racked with the bayonets fixed. We know that they had to fix the bayonets to the muskets. Interesting, this is a mistake. You see how loose fitting this uniform is. This is not correct. This is correct, but I tell you, I was exhausted working. I thought the guy was going to kill me at the end because we kept reworking this painting to get it historically correct. The light dragoon in the background is correct. And anyway, on this note, I think that that is where we're going to end, right? I hope you enjoyed that, and I look forward to some future presentations. Thank you very much.
Well, Art, thank you so much for a very enlightening and educational presentation. We'd love to have you back, and we'll be talking about that in the not too distant future. So we'd like to have you talk about your other books, and we are exploring the possibility, of course, of doing a video of the turtle and some other aspects of your books. So here to wrap things up is our president, Jeff.
Art, again, thank you so much for a terrific presentation. I learned a lot. I've been reenacting since 1980, and I knew a lot, but you brought some more light to some subjects that I didn't know about. Special thanks to our friend Ted Hammer, who's been acting as our technical assistant here during this presentation. To our viewers, if you have any questions that you would like to submit to Art about this lecture, you can simply just go to our website, www.yart.org, and click on any of the board members' names, and we'd be happy to pass it along to Art for his consideration. This concludes our first Williamsburg-Yorktown American Revolutionary Roundtable presentation with Arthur Lefkowitz, author, Eyewitness Images of the American Revolution. For that, I thank you, and I look forward for you to join us in the future. Take care.